First of all, thank you all for joining us here and spending this time with us, and to really take the time for development for yourself and also the community. So I just want to really celebrate that and be appreciative of that nature within all of us, which is that sort of growth and self-development. And I'll introduce Glenda, who is our speaker tonight. I came across Glenda's work quite some time ago, probably a couple of years ago now, I would say. And I've been very sort of on the periphery of sort of looking in until about sort of 6 months, 7 months ago, I would say. And I started watching some of the videos to start with. And I don't know, Glenda, whether you can just download the videos from your site or whether you have to be a subscriber. And I forget, because I subscribe to your newsletter, which is well worth subscribing to. Yeah.
So anyone can download all of the materials. All the resources on our site are open source.
And I strongly recommend it, because every time I watch one of the videos, one of the calls, there's meetings like this where there's lots of people. There's also videos that Glenda has done and other people have produced as well, looking at certain topics. And every time I watch one of those videos, some light bulb goes on. And for those of you who have come here from the Agile community or from AWA, we've done lots of things in our community. There are certain sort of, I wouldn't call them buzzwords, but certain threads of conversation or ideas that float through our community. And we take those and we make new models out of them, we try them out. And when I came across Glenda's work, it really takes a lot of these things to another level. There's a whole different aspect, a whole different lens, a different viewpoint of her work, and the whole human systems way of looking at things is just, it really is incredible. And I do believe that from an Agile community perspective, we've got so much to learn from all of the things that Glenda and her community have been working on. So I really do strongly recommend that you look at her website. And I did have the link here, here it is, that Glenda sent to me for so I'll put this in the chat. This is the website. And Glenda will be running a certified cohort course as well. So do check that out on the website as well. And I think that starts in June. So if you look at the videos, you like what you see tonight, it resonates with you. If there's something here which you feel is like, oh, I want to know more about that, check out the website. And then you can also look at the certification program that she will be running very shortly, in a month or so's time. So do check that out as well. So with so that's kind of Glenda's work. And then to introduce Glenda, we've had a couple of chats now, and every time I've just felt this massive warmth, such a connection of real human connection, of really such love for people and the systems that we work with. And I think that that's something that we can all bring to our work, and I know that working with you, Glenda, here, especially tonight, is almost certainly going to shine that through. And it's such a pleasure to have that space of feeling looked after and connection every time I talk to you. And so thank you for that deep respect that you have for my time and who I am when I'm with you. And I'm sure that that is something which can be extrapolated out in anything that we think of. Thank you for that. So I hand us over into your brilliant hands for us this evening. And thank you for being here. Thank you.
Simon, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction and this opportunity to spend a bit of time with your community. I was saying to Simon earlier that the Agile community particularly, and a community of people who come to learn together, is just really a delight. So I'm happy to be with you. I'm particularly happy to be with you because when I first began to work with human systems, I came out of a world of physics and history and philosophy of science. And so I thought of myself as an engineer. And when I first started working with human systems, I thought it was great. I could make a plan, I could construct a product, I could deliver it on time and under budget. It was great until it wasn't. So some of you may be old enough to remember when I first started working with technology, we were writing technical training and documentation, and they would send to us the external design, and the programmers would program, and we would create the training and documentation 2 weeks before delivery. This would be 2 years later. 2 weeks before delivery, they'd test out the training and documentation on the developed product, and it would be within 10%. That's how stable the world was in those days. And so as a traditional engineer, and that kind of stability and certainty and predictability was my life's blood in the work that I did. And then things started to change. Technology shifted, demographics shifted, my clients went global, my staff began to grow and shift and change, and I realized that the world was in transition, and it is still in transition. It was in that time that I ran across chaos theory. Some of you may have read Glick's book, Chaos: Making a New Science. And it was in that book that I found something that was both scientifically valid and open to complexity and emergence. And it was at that intersection that I've spent my whole life using it in my own leadership, sharing with others, writing and teaching, and developing a theory base that allows us to stand in a scientific validity, a robust place of scientific understanding without certainty. So that's what I want to share with you today. There are two things that set our work apart from other people's complexity work. One is that we're very practical. So I'm going to invite each of you to think of a particular wicked issue that you're working on, something that has you stuck. And I'm going to ask you to think about it through our time together. I'm going to define wicked issue in a minute, but practicality is so important that we understand systems in order to take action. We don't understand systems as an end in itself. At least that's the place we stand in human systems dynamics. The other thing that sets us apart is that we believe in simplicity. Because in a world that is complex with lots of things happening, fast change in many dimensions simultaneously, we don't have time to pause and do a complicated analysis of a complex system before we act. And so my hope in the work that I've done is to find simple tools that are elegant and flexible and generalizable. And so the tools that I'm going to share with you today are going to seem to be a bit naive and simple, but I think as you apply them in your practice, you'll see their power. So with that bit of start, I do want to say I am very comfortable with interaction throughout. I would love it if you would open your chat and use your chat to chat with each other, with me, with Simon. He's going to be watching the chat and sharing questions as they come up. So please think of this as a dialogue as we move forward. We should tell you too that we're recording. Some of you are probably accustomed to that, but so I invite you to engage in dialogue or open your chat and share. And certainly we'll have time at the end for some discussion and questions as well. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to be talking about taming wicked issues. Some of you may be familiar with the wicked issue literature. It goes back a ways. It started in the mid-70s when urban planners began to realize that they had questions that their traditional reductionist problem-solving techniques could not touch. They called them wicked issues. I also would like to tell you how to pronounce my last name. It's pronounced Eoyang, as if it were Irish, Eoyang. It's a Chinese name, and I can tell you that story at some point, but not at this very moment. So when we talk about a wicked issue, it's very specifically an emergent issue in open systems. So if you're working in a system that's open and high dimension and nonlinear, then the assumptions in traditional problem solving don't work. You can't divide something up into parts to solve it because there's no boundary within which there are parts. The system is changing in a nonlinear way so quickly that even if you took it apart and solved one piece, by the time you tried to put it back into the whole would have moved on without you. And so traditional problem-solving methods do not work. There's no stopping function. There's no single endpoint. There's no root cause. So if you've ever in your total quality work tried to ask the 5 whys to get to a root cause, why that, and why that, and why that, but you end up in a circle, end up where you started, that's probably a wicked issue, that there's no root cause because all causes are also effects. There are lots of ways to think and talk about wicked issues, but none of those solutions is perfect. So if you think about questions of performance or quality, certainly relationships, and your own professional development, there isn't a sole and single solution to those. They will never be solved. But your job in working with them is to see them, to see the challenge as clearly and completely as you can, to understand it in a way that's useful. There are 100 different ways to understand a wicked issue, but you're looking for one that's useful. And then you take action and you move forward. So one of my favorite examples, and this was one that Riddle and Weber used, was about poverty. So poverty has lots of causes. I may think it's because of lack of education. And so my solution will be to educate everybody. Might be economic development, in which case I would bring in economic development. But there is no solution to poverty. An infinite number of approaches. It can appear to be fixed in a small space, but then it will come unfixed. So that's what a wicked issue is. Many different ones and many different kinds. So I'd like for you to think of one. It can have to do, it can be a personal one. It can be one with your team. It could be one with a client. It could even be a technical issue. I was talking this morning with a fellow who's working on machine learning, and it is indeed a wicked issue. So I'd like for you to think of one and just take a piece of paper or notes and write 3 sentences about that wicked issue. I will give you a minute.
Sorry, could we see the previous slide again, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Does anyone need more time? So if you're a parent, you can see how parenting is this kind of an issue. So wicked issues are not always negative. They're not always bad. Falling in love, marriage is a wicked issue. Certainly raising children is a wicked issue. And if you don't have any wicked issues, you might want to reflect to see if you are somebody else's wicked issue. That's always a possibility. So does everybody have one? Just to focus on today. And what I'm going to ask you to do as I share models and methods and ideas is to go back into that wicked issue, because what you're looking for is not a solution. What you're looking for is the next wise action. What is one thing that you can do that will shift that pattern in a direction that's useful? So that's what the wicked issue is. So the first tool, and this is the core kind of engine for decision-making in human systems dynamics, we call it adaptive action. And it's a very simple learning and practice cycle. It'll be very familiar to you from many contexts: quality, learning cycles, action research, scientific method. We use it in a very concrete way. So the what is the current situation? What is the pattern you observe? What's the research? So what can you see in this moment? Now that's what you did when you wrote down your 3 sentences. That was your what. Now it is not a complete picture. Remember, we're working in an open system, so there's no such thing as a complete picture. But what you have there is a model of this wicked issue. When you look at those 3 sentences, you have the core set of features that are going to be levers for you to make change. So those 3 sentences can be your model from which you work. And that's what you do in what. I often will begin a challenging project by asking each person in the room to write 3 sentences about it. And then we compare and contrast. And what we come up with is a multifaceted, but fairly simple view of what's most essential. It's not complete, but it's essential. That's the what. The so what is the problem solving or meaning making step. So what are the effects of the conditions in this moment? Where are the tensions? What's important? What's relevant? What's insignificant? What are options that we have? What are pros and cons? What are risks and benefits as we understand them? What does success really look like in this moment? Not long term, but what is a shift that might be possible in this pattern, in this moment? And the so what uses any kinds of tools that you bring with you. So in human systems dynamics, we don't ask you to forget any of the tools that you have that work. Bring them all along. You can use them in data collection. You can use them in analysis and so what. And you can use them in action taking in now what. The third step is now what. That for the sake of which. So this efficient cause in an Aristotelian system is how you move forward. Now, what are you going to do? What are you going to measure? What are you going to communicate? And what are you going to look for to see to begin your next cycle? Because in a complex system with things as connected together as they are, everything you do will result in some change to your pattern. For better or for worse, it will shift the pattern and open another possibility for the next what. Now, this cycle can be very fast. You've probably each done it 100 times since we began. And it can be used to build 5-year strategic plans, which we've done with agricultural teams in Africa. So it can be very small for an individual person in a moment, or it can be massive, and the data collection and understanding and action can be spread over a long period of time. One of our colleagues in Brazil uses this in place of traditional medical logic for diagnosis and decision-making. You'll see it reflected in lots of the Agile practices, this same what, so what, now what. Diana Larson, who has written about retrospectives and liftoff, she's one of our associates and has used adaptive action deeply in the work she's done. So I told you it'd be simple, and it is. So I'm curious, Simon, do you have any questions or comments about this? Are you seeing anything in the chat space about this simple yet surprisingly powerful tool?
So we haven't got any questions in the chat yet. So I would ask if there is anything, please do add it to the chat, and then we can have these little spaces like this. For me, I'm just thinking, yeah, this is awesome. Yeah, and you rock. So yeah, I think it is. It's like, this is brilliant. It's the right simplicity with huge depth. Such a massive depth there, yeah, I haven't got any questions myself at the moment.
Okay, that's great. There are 2 things that have been really interesting. One is translating it into other languages, that often the words what, so what, now what, we keep regardless of the language of the translation and implementation. We also have used this with kindergarten children, 4- and 5-year-olds, who are teaching each other to read, to do adaptive action for their own analysis of reading. So the reason that this works is because of the way that we think of systems. When we first began to do this work, we looked at many different systems, models, and methods to figure out a way to think and talk about systems in a way that would be easy for people to make real in their lives and work. And so complex adaptive system was that path that we chose. As you know, there are probably 75 different systems analysis approaches, and this is the one we find most useful. And this is its story. It begins with agents that interact. Now let's just take the simplest case, members of your team. They're different, they interact, and over time, a system-wide pattern begins to emerge. Maybe they're a high-performing team. Maybe they're a troubled team. Maybe they're a team that is very artistic and creative and innovative, or reliable and predictable. But patterns emerge as those people interact. And once the patterns emerge, it constrains the players in future cycles. So if someone comes into a high-performing team, they are likely to rise to the performance of that team. If they come to a dysfunctional team, even if they're high performers individually, they're going to fall into the patterns of the dysfunctional team. So this is a pattern that'll be very familiar to you as leaders, as Agile coaches. And this scales, just like you can take adaptive action and use it in an instant or in a long-term project. Complex adaptive systems scale as well. So you can think about the agents as cells in your body, or organs, tissues, organs, and that what emerges is a pattern of health and well-being or illness, and that tends to replicate itself. You can think about it as neighborhoods in a city, or cities in a state, or players in an economy, or entities in a pandemic. So in the course of this year, as we have been looking for individuals and trying to reduce our own illness and possibility of illness, we have seen our complex adaptive systems shrink and be tightly bounded by our homes and our places, and hoping that a pattern of health and physical well-being comes to be. But we know that simultaneously, some of the agents are our emotional and psychological and social needs, and that those interactions have brought up patterns of isolation and anxiety and fear, and in some cases violence. And so those two patterns are simultaneously growing and influencing each other. And so when we are doing our adaptive action and asking what, we have to kind of ask which what? What's the what that's going to draw our attention for the action that we want to take? And which are the patterns that are going to go into the background? Agents, interactions, and patterns. Each of the agents is itself a self-organizing system. And so as you turn now to back to your own wicked issue, what are the agents? What are the things that are interacting? They don't even have to be physical things. They can be memes. They can be ideas. They can be emotions. What are the agents that are showing up in your 3 sentences? And what are the patterns that are emerging from those? And that's the first way to begin to think about this as a tool for problem solving. So I'm just going to give you a minute to look at your wicked issue and say, what are the agents in yours? Would you please just type them into chat? Thinking about your own wicked issue. What are the agents that are playing there? Just put them in chat.
Whilst people are doing that, there was a question here as well, Glenda, about the nature of the time span. So looking at you mentioned a 5-year plan as a possibility, but then also looking, so I think this was Greg asking about the open nature of the system. I don't know if you want to articulate that a bit better, Greg, into a question that Glenda might be able to have a go answering.
Hi, Greg, what are you thinking?
Well, you're touching on the fact that the agents, the agents and system co-evolve. So the question comes in, to what planning horizons can you actually apply to this? So I'm interested in your take on this.
Yeah, so that's a good question. You can focus on any planning horizon, but that sets the range of what kinds of interactions you can pay attention to.
Okay, so you pitch it that way, yes.
You just tune it. You tune your definition of the system to whatever time horizon is interesting. So the good thing about that is that it's incredibly flexible, but that's also a challenge because then it requires experimentation to find the right balance.
And there is, and that brings you on to the temporal discussion, which I think you touched on as well. You can't always spend time doing the analysis. Sometimes you actually have to be able to act in the short term.
Yes, in fact, in complex systems, you cannot fully analyze them without action.
Yes.
Because the system only gives you information when you prod it with a now what, and then you get more information. And so that this cycle isn't that you're waiting to find the right answer and take the right step, but you're finding out what you can about the pattern so you can plan something to act so that you make an effect, but so that you also learn. And so this idea about it's being iterative is just fundamental to the work. It's like a sprint, right? The other thing is to see that these are embedded. And so when we did the 5-year plan, it wasn't a single adaptive action cycle. There were what, so what, now what within the what, and what, so what, now what within the so what. And so that each of them, they're nested within the larger scale. Good question. So what are we seeing as agent examples here? I'm going to open my chat, see if I can see. Yeah, Claudia, the analysis is never complete. I don't know if you know about Gödel and Gödel's theorem. He said either a system is closed and internally consistent, in which case you can know it, or it's open and it's impossible to be internally consistent. So in the systems that you're working in that are closed and internally consistent, you've got all the skills you need to answer that. All of the discipline that you studied will teach you how to solve closed system problems. And those are not the ones that keep you awake at night. The ones that keep you awake at night are the ones that are open, high dimension, lots of variables, and nonlinear connections. And that's the place where human systems dynamics is really most useful. Cool. Persistent beliefs and assumptions. This has been such an interesting time to watch the political transformation in the UK and in the US about what are the agents, how are they playing together, what are the patterns, what were the small changes that happened very early in the Brexit transition, what did Cameron do really to set this up in the first place, and how did that get amplified into the place where you stand today? And of course, there's a parallel in the US, which we're not going to talk about. All right, so you can see how this is both physical, this can be emotional, it can be mental, it can be political, it can be, we do a lot of work in conservation where the agents are traders in illegal wildlife. So then the question becomes, if you see those agents and those interactions, what is a wise action? What might you do? Seeing that group of agents and the possibility for those patterns, what is one thing you might do? Add another agent, take one away, focus in on a single agent, see a different pattern, connect the agents together more tightly, or disconnect them. What is an action that you might take? Looking at your 3 sentences, just one little thing you can do. I often say, what's something you can do today to complete an adaptive action cycle? If you have an idea for an action, just write it down. We'll come back. So that's the first tool. The second one we want to talk about is called pattern logic. And this is, if you have a complex adaptive system and it is agents interacting and creating patterns that reinforce, that system is like an engine generating wicked issues. And as long as that agents, interactions, and patterns are forming, as long as that's going, your job, if you want to shift that pattern, is to find a way to intervene. And this was research that I did in the late 90s about all kinds of complexity research. But what we found was that there were patterns in those systems. And when we say pattern, we mean something very specific. A pattern is similarities. So in that complex system, when you think about the agents, how are they the same? Those will show up in the patterns in a kind of coherence. So if you think about your team members, how are they the same? Are they approximately the same age? Are they the same gender? Do they speak the same languages? Do they have the same work ethic? What are the things that bring that system that you're looking at together? If you're thinking about an emotional system, what are the similarities in the feelings that you have? Do they all grow from childhood? Are they all in a process of transition right now? So if you think about your 3 sentences, what are some of the things that are similarities in that complex adaptive system? The similarities are good because they hold a system together. They give it affinity to stick together, which is great. But if a system is too much similarity, what happens? I've been in that team where nothing happens because there's no energy to move forward. It's called, scientists call it entropy, right? Where there's so much similarity that the system can't even get off symmetry to move forward in any way. You've probably been in that team as well. One of the things I think that organization development practitioners often do is that they push so hard for common ground, for similarity, to get coherence, that then the system ends up helpless because it isn't able to bring forth the differences to make something happen. And so HSD is very careful to balance similarities in the emergent pattern with differences. Now, differences are really interesting in these complex systems for 2 reasons. One is that's where the meaning sits. That's how we make sense of something. So if you look at your 3 sentences, what are the differences that make a difference there? And that tells you what the sense-making potential is in that. If your 3 sentences are about basketball players, I would guess that height would be one of the differences that make a difference. And you can imagine that height would be critical in a pattern of a basketball team. You know that in your teams, there's certain differences that are important. Technical skills and abilities are important, but that's not the only difference that makes a good team. You also need a team that's able to have empathy or curiosity, innovation. And so what are the differences across your team? Now, if everybody in the team is innovative, you're not going to be able to get much done, right? You need some people who are going to hold steady and others who are going to move you forward. And that creates tension. And that's the second reason why differences are so important in these systems. It's because that tension is the engine for change. That difference creates tension. Tension is a form of potential energy, and it can be converted to work. Just like electrical energy. Take a car battery. You got a plus pole and a minus pole. That difference is the potential for a current to flow. And so if you can see in a system what the differences are, then that is your opportunity for change, for learning, for growth, for possibility. And so differences are key in these systems because they give you meaning. They also give you potential for action. Then the third factor is the one that activates that potential. And those are the connections. That if your positive and negative poles of your battery aren't connected, nothing's going to happen. But if there's a wire that will allow the flow to happen, then change will come about. Now, in a team, your connections may be during meetings. They may be your stand-ups. They may be the kind of documentation that you keep. They may be the online tracking systems that you have. They may be individual coaching conversations. They may be, there was a time when they were physical touch or sitting down at a table and having a cup of coffee. That those connections are the things that activate the differences in the context of the similarities to make change. So I'm going to invite you to look again at your issue and to ask yourself in your 3 sentences, what are the key similarities that are there? What holds that system together? It may be explicit in your 3 sentences, or it may lie between the words in your 3 sentences. What are the differences that make a difference there? And what are the connections that activate change? And what can you do to increase the similarities, to increase the differences, or refocus on the differences, to connect things or to disconnect them? Now what? Now this will probably be a different action than the CAS suggested for you. Your point at this time is to generate as many possible actions as you can, and then you choose whichever one seems best. So this is a second option. The third tool I want to share with you is inquiry, to stand in inquiry. And we knew that in uncertainty, to be able to ask questions was such a key factor. And it's easier said than done. So not all questions are created equal. How do you find a way to ask questions that are most useful? Those of you who are coaches spend your lives looking for good questions. And these are our 4 simple rules for ways to ask questions so that you are being in inquiry. Inquiry becomes then a state of being as opposed to just an activity. Now, I want to say for sure, I don't always achieve this, but I'm always striving to turn judgment into curiosity, so that when I feel myself locking into some judgment, I begin to look for what is an honest, authentic, curious question that I can ask in that place and time. Judgment into curiosity. And what that does is to get me unstuck, and it also allows the conversation to get unstuck. Now, that doesn't mean you won't ever be in judgment. There are times when you have to be in judgment, but there are also times when that is not serving you well, and curiosity is an option. The second is to turn disagreement or conflict into shared exploration. So if there's conflict in a human system, there's energy locked inside it. It's stuck, it's wicked. And if you can release that energy by going into a shared exploration, then the system can move forward. All of these things are ways about decreasing constraint, increasing degrees of freedom, so that you have some choices to move forward. The third is my personal favorite and most difficult, to turn defensiveness into self-reflection. This is particularly important in times of quick change, of unpredictability, because I'm an expert. I'm a competent person. And so when something happens that surprises me or catches me on my back foot, or if it challenges my assumptions in the things that I've done in the past, then I become defensive and get more and more and more locked in. But if I can open in self-reflection, shift those assumptions into questions, then the world begins to open up and there are new possibilities that emerge. So this is a tool that you can use to say, what are my current judgments? As you think about your 3 sentences, what are the judgments that you're making there? And what conflict or disagreement sits in that space? And is there defensiveness, yours or others? And what are assumptions? And then to say, so what of those are really giving you trouble? So what is possible to shift? So what is within your control? So what do you have willingness and ability to change? And now what are you going to do? What one thing might you do to find a curiosity or to find a self-reflection or shared exploration? What, so what, now what? So I invite you to think about standing in inquiry with your wicked issue and what is one thing you might be able to do. Again, not to solve it, just to shift it. They're not problems to be solved, but patterns to be shifted. What's one next wise action? And so these tools, these simple tools to be able to stand in inquiry, that you're not looking for an answer, because in these wicked issues, there isn't an answer. What you're looking for is some way to keep the cycle of inquiry and understanding and action moving forward. I'm going to say again, our vision, and invite you into that vision, that people everywhere thrive because we see patterns clearly, we seek to understand, and we act with courage to transform turbulence and uncertainty into possibility for all. So I'm really curious about your questions and your comments. This is a place where you can collect other information, get other information about HSD. I'll be sending this slide deck to Simon, and I'm sure that he has a way to get it to you one way or another. As I said at the beginning, our intellectual property policy is totally open. Anything you learn from us, you're welcome to use. We're passionate about getting this work into people's hands. What we ask is that if you use it, you cite the source and that you teach us back. That as you use these tools in your own life and work, as you make discoveries, which you certainly will, that you share those back with us. We have a daily ritual that we've started doing in the middle of March in 2020, and it's the power of questions. And it lasts 30 minutes. People come together, somebody brings a wicked issue, and everyone else asks them questions for about 15 minutes. They don't answer, they just listen to the questions. And then that person talks about what they heard in the questions, what they might do, and then we end the call. It's 30 minutes, Monday through Friday. We just finished, I think, session 287 today. And it was about how do you measure coherence, or how do you measure adaptability? It was a great wicked issue time. And you're welcome to join us if you send a note to info@hsdinstitute.org. You can find that too on the website. You'll receive reminders. We have monthly webinars that are free. We have blog posts that are free. We do adaptive action labs, zeroing in on particular issues. There's the certification that Simon mentioned earlier, the website, their books, there's a lot of stuff there. But the most important thing is that you recognize that if you are seeing patterns clearly, seeking to understand them, and taking the actions that are within your ability to shift, that your wicked issues will not be solved, but they'll be tamed. So I'm going to stop sharing and wonder what questions or comments or insights you're seeing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Glenda, so much. That was awesome. So do feel free to come off mute and speak your questions now as well, rather than having to write them into chat. And I'm sure Glenda will be happy to answer them if she can.
Mhm.
May I share? May I ask a question?
Please.
Apologies, my bandwidth is quite poor and I've got my video switched off. This is Geeta. I was just curious, could you share an example of a what, so what, now what expansion of a sample wicked issue, if you like?
Sure. So in the midst of COVID, I got a call from a client. It was a healthcare situation where the chief of a department, the head doctor in a department, had begun to say racist things. And I live in Minneapolis, where we were in the midst this summer of very important, very dangerous racial issues. And so that was the what that they gave to me. The what was, this leader is using racist language. Can I come in and fix her? That was the now what they wanted. Well, as I said, well, let me get some more information about what. And so I interviewed her and I interviewed all of her staff and I interviewed some of the patients who had been in their care. And that was the what, for me to see a broader picture, because at the scale that they were defining the problem, they had an adaptive action, but in a very constrained space. And I knew, and they knew too, that there was no fixing this woman. So the what cycle I did was to collect a lot of data, lots of interviews. In the so what, I looked for patterns. What are the similarities and differences? And what are the connections among the staff? And I discovered three things in that process. One was that this leader did not work on site, and she had not been on site at all throughout the COVID time. The second thing was that she had had relationships of long standing with some of her staff, but many of her other staff had come recently, and they knew her in very different ways. And the third was that she herself has a family of mixed race, adopted children, or a variety of, so her family system is mixed race. And so I thought, okay, given those patterns, now what might we do? Now what is a way that we might approach this question? So I said, oh, well, it would be great if she would just show up and get to know people. So I told her, recommended her, coached her that she really should show up, that she should be present in the office, and that she should go every day. And she said, no, I don't need to go every day. I don't want to go every day. I'm not going to do that. I've got more important things to do. All righty. Well, that's interesting. And so I asked her about what she thought about, race and racial issues and concerns, and what she thought about the unrest that had been going on. And she was very angry that members of her staff had stood up in support of George Floyd and had marched as white coats for Black lives. And she was very angry about that. I suggested that she go into dialogue. No, I won't do that. Okay. And so one by one, the patterns that I saw, I realized were ones that she was not going to be willing to move. And so my ultimate now what was to talk to her, the chief medical officer and the chief executive officer, and suggest that they remove her from leadership. But that was after a variety of cycles of what, so what, now what. Geeta, is that helpful?
Very helpful. In fact, brilliant example. Thank you. I'm just curious about one thing in what you've just described. Normally, when I use what, so what, now what with my coaches, I'm a professional coach as well. Often it's for an inner search of how you respond. And there is a certain inner clarity you have that you unpick and bring to the surface through the so what, now what process. because oftentimes the coachee does not have the means to go and do this exhaustive search for data or like interviewing people. So that's one curiosity I have. And the other final other piece is here, did you get that leader's acknowledgement and agreement that they were indeed being racist? Or was there an explicit acknowledgement, yes, I am? Or was it just these questions around it, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. So she didn't acknowledge that she was racist, but what she acknowledged was that the Black people in the community should get busy and get jobs.
Mm.
So, so the things that she said would be heard as racial bias, but she just thought they were true things.
Mm.
Then the question about using adaptive action for internal review. Those of you who know about liberating structures, and I think Keith calls it the 3 W's in liberating structures, is very much about self-knowledge and about social knowledge and building an understanding of the human dynamics. And we use what, so what, now what for that, but we also use it for work in the real world, in the ontological world of making stuff happen outside myself. And this is, Keith and I have been friends and have worked together for a very long time. And it's just a fundamental difference that we have. It's partly the pragmatism that drives me. I want people to be able to do things and make a difference in the world in which I live. And so to be able to say, what about that? So what, now what? And recognizing you may not be able to collect all the data in the world. You just got to use what you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I used what I knew from that first interview with the client to build my next adaptive action, to ask for freedom to do the interviews, to ask for. So wherever you begin, with whatever you know, take whatever action you can, and then you'll know more and take more action. Geeta, there's one more thing that's really important, is that you can't do somebody else's adaptive action.
I was wondering about that, yeah.
Yeah, you can't. And this is a trap that we often get into, right? If they would this, this, and this,
yeah,
then we'll be good. But what that does is to get me stuck in without doing my own action. If my so what is somebody else should do something, it is not useful. Even if it's true, and it may be true, but it's not useful. What I need is a so what that it will inform my action. That's why we say next wise action.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I was just wondering about that because it seemed like you were doing her what, so what, now what as well.
Well, in telling the story, right? And I was hired to coach her, and in some ways, that's what a coach does, right? Is to enter in the so what step and help people find a way to understand what might happen.
True. Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Good questions, Geeta. Let's see.
So we had another question here, and the question was, how much do you tell the people that you are working with about the theory or about the whole of the systems dynamics or human systems dynamics as you're going along?
Boy, that's a good question. And the answer is, it depends. You won't be surprised. It depends. So if the client really wants to build their own capacity to do the work, they need to have some level of understanding of the theory that lies behind it. But very few people need to know the depth of the theory that lies behind it, the Western philosophy and the history of philosophy and history of science and the understanding of complexity. And all. Most people don't need that level of understanding, but they need some way to understand the relationship between tension and difference and change. And but I almost never begin there. I always begin, as we did today, with a wicked issue. And it's in the context of that wicked issue that we talk about tools and possibilities and actions. And sometimes when I facilitate, I don't even do that. I'll just ask a question. I have the tool or model in my head. We have about 35 models and methods that we use. That these are examples of. I'll have one in my head that's inspiring the question, but I don't even make that explicit. And when I do that, there's almost always one person in a crowd who comes to me afterwards and said, "That was magic. What happened? How did that happen? How did you get that group to move forward together?" And when someone asks, then I share. When I began this work, I thought everybody would be as interested in it as I was, and I talked about it a lot. And I got a lot of rolling eyes. And so what I do now is respond to people's questions. If people are asking about the theory, we talk about the theory. If people are talking about the practice, asking about the practice, we talk about that. So it's what we call fit for function.
Fantastic. I think probably many of us have been through that, expecting everybody else to have the same level of enthusiasm for change and understanding systems as we do. And we're all sorely disappointed when it isn't the case. But yes, that's brilliant. Fantastic. I like that being pulled to where how much to share. I think that's a fantastic take.
Someone once asked me, when someone asks a question, what am I thinking about as I listen to the question? And I said, I'm trying to figure out where that question is coming from. What is that person missing? Or what is giving them tension that they would ask that question? And it's not until I come to some understanding about that I even begin to think about an answer. And I suspect this is something many of you do in practice. I see there's a question about the about our logo. It is one of the earliest fractals. It's called a Sierpinski Gasket. And it's a very simple but very powerful fractal structure. So you can see that the outside shape is embedded with smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller equilateral triangles. And if you search for Sierpinski Gasket, there are ones that are 3-dimensional and n-dimensional Sierpinski gaskets. They're great. I'll write it down, Sierpin. Sometimes it's called Sierpinski fractal. So I appreciate your seeing it, wondering about it.
Brilliant. So we're very nearly out of time, but if there's perhaps time for one more question, or we could end there.
If it's feasible, I would like to have a go.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot for wonderful talk, first of all. And many a times, I think with the examples of wicked issues you had mentioned, it's difficult to term them as such because people tend to not look at the patterns and look at it as a problem. So definitely that lead me to think about my question, which is many organizations which goes through the transformation. So they tend to think transformation is a process which can be used via some external framework adoption as such. For example, I'm in IT, so if you are using SAFe, then it is an easier way for you because it has the define. And then you will have at the other end of the spectrum, people who are saying if you're going SAFe, then you are not anyway going to become agile. So how you are just redefining the roles. So there are different perceptions, but from the leader's perspective, how does the transformation objective should be set? Means in that context, whom should you be coaching as the HCD consultant? So yeah, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And it's a really persistent question. What a great wicked one. So my experience in my consulting is that I can never convince someone that their assumptions are incorrect. So to go to someone who thinks that they can buy and implement a transformation, it doesn't matter what I say to them. They're not going to understand that. They're not going to believe it. So what I say instead is, if you start with that assumption, what would you do? And what do you expect to have happen? And if it doesn't happen, then they say, oh, I should have done it better. So they'll do it again, but do it better. But there's some point at which they get back to the what stage and they say, I'm being really surprised. I don't know what's going on. They go into the so what with a much more open mind. And it won't be in the first cycle, it won't be in the second cycle, but it will be at some point. They will recognize that their current way of acting is not getting them the outcomes they want. And so my job as a consultant is to just keep asking that question. What do you want to do? What do you expect? So what happened? Now what sense do we make of it? What are we going to do next? And by going into that learning cycle with them, they're able to move forward. And it doesn't matter what level. You can do this with senior executives. You can do it with mid-level managers who are often much more difficult to move into transformation than the highest levels. You can do it with individual practitioners. So I often ask this question, do you know who Dr. Phil is? Dr. Phil is a television psychologist here. And he asks the question, like, how's that working for you? So he has this Texas accent. How's that working for you? He'll say. And so that's what I held in mind. So that's what you think. That's what you're seeing. How's it working for you? Is it working for you? That's great. I'll support you. How's that working for you? But it really is this belief in self-organizing systems, that leader is her own self-organizing system, building based on the agents they see, seeing the patterns they understand, that's the world that they're working in. And it doesn't really matter what you do from the outside. That's not going to shift. What you can do is influence the agents that they're looking at and invite them into another way. So my inquiry is the most important thing that I bring to the client, the questions I can ask. It's a great question.
Thanks. It opens up in a profound way a lot of insights I could take to my own engagements. So thanks a lot.
Great. You're welcome. You're welcome. And wouldn't it be great if we could solve that one? Wouldn't it be great if that were a problem to solve? But it's not. It's not. It's a pattern to shift.
Yeah.
So I think our time is gone. Simon, I want to say thank you again for holding this community as you do, and with the curiosity that you do. So, and inviting me into it today.
And thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing all this wisdom so generously. And I'm sure that all of us here have learned huge amounts. And if we want to continue along this line of thought, just reminding about Glenda's website and carrying on that learning. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for the questions as well. It's been absolutely brilliant. And I hope to see you again soon, Glenda, and all of you indeed. Thanks very much. Have a good rest of day or evening, depending on where you are. And we'll see you all again at another meetup. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.